organized Senate on the 4th of March, Inauguration Day. For his part, close observer James Madison, who unlike Jefferson had never been an Adams admirer, held, "The conduct of Mr. Adams is not such as was to have been wished, and perhaps even expected. Instead of smoothing the path for his successor, he plays into the hands of those who are endeavoring to strew it with as many difficulties as possible, and with this view does not manifest a very squeamish regard to the Constitution," unquote. So pressed at his election a mere 15 days prior to his inauguration left Jefferson that he sent a letter to his intended Secretary of War offering him the job the same day as he wrote informing Madison of the result. The following day, Jefferson wrote imploring Meriwether Lewis to serve as his private secretary. The young Army captain's knowledge of the Western country, of the Army, and of all its interests and relations had made him especially fitted for this post, which, Jefferson hastened to add, several other men had requested. While it did not pay well, it would put Lewis in contact with men whose acquaintance would help him later his career, not least of them, it went without saying, President Jefferson himself. A few days later, the president-elect informed Chancellor Robert Livingston of New York that he chose him to be minister plenipotentiary to France, a post which Livingston soon accepted, and which he would fill to momentous effect for himself, for the United States, and for the Jefferson administration. About the same time, Jefferson repeated his observation about the popular effect of Federalist congressmen's machinations during the House proceedings. He then noted that Adams calling the Senate, imperfect as it will be on the 4th of March, into session, could lead to rejection of Jefferson's leading appointments. This, to be sure, Jefferson concluded, would dismast our ship before leaving port. "I know the difficulties of the station to which I am called," Jefferson assured Representative Pinckney's delegation, "and feel and acknowledge my incompetence to them. But whatsoever of understanding, whatsoever of diligence, whatsoever of justice, or of affectionate concern for the happiness of man, it has pleased Providence to place within the compass of my faculties, shall be called forth for the discharge of the duties confided to me, and for procuring to my fellow citizens all the benefits which our Constitution has placed under the guardianship of the general government. Guided by the wisdom and patriotism of those to whom it belongs to express the legislative will of the nation, I will give to that will a faithful execution," unquote. On February 28, 1801, Vice President Jefferson resigned his office to make way for the Senate to select a new president pro tempore. He addressed the Senate in his characteristic way, noting that he, no doubt, had erred in his role as the Senate's president and holding that for honest errors, however, indulgence may be hoped. Thus spoke Jefferson on February 20th. Due to the prolonged standoff in the House, if he put off writing it until certain of his election, Jefferson had only 12 days to prepare his first inaugural address for delivery on the 4th of March. Every indication is he had not waited to begin writing it. Jefferson's first inaugural address is one of only a handful of such speeches that repay a reading. Despite its sparkling eloquence and striking economy of expression, however, the mere text only tells part of the story. The Revolution of 1800, as Jefferson later dubbed his party's electoral conquest, began before the new president laid his manuscript on the lectern. Part of that revolution was to be a sharp shift in manners. The occasion of George Washington's first inauguration had become one extended celebration of the Continental Army's only commander-in-chief. En route from Mount Vernon on the Potomac to Manhattan on the Hudson, Washington progressed from one festivity to the next. Local militia detachments escorted him, young ladies feted him, leading citizens of towns through which he passed held celebratory balls in his honor. It was Washington who decided, without prompting from the Constitution, that there needs be a presidential speech in conjunction with the prescribed oath. With help from Representative James Madison, Washington prepared and delivered a classic Virginian inauguration address. It began with an avowal that he had not wanted or felt qualified for the job, proceeded through a lengthy observation about an unnamed God's essential aid in winning the revolution and establishing the Constitution, rested for a while on the idea that the success of the Federal Republic would depend on the morality of office holders and of the people in general, stopped briefly upon a call for constitutional amendments to buttress individual rights, added a disavowal of any desire for a salary, and concluded with a prayer to, quote, the benign parent of the human race, unquote, to superintend the new government's activity. The whole ceremony took place before a crowd of onlookers on Wall Street, again, at Washington's instigation. Washington's second inaugural address was 4 sentences long. It said that he was called again to enter upon the presidential office, that he someday would express his, quote, high sense of that distinguished honor, that the Constitution required that he take the oath prior to entering into the presidential office, and that witnesses to his taking it would be able to reprimand him in case he violated it. Washington's successor, John Adams, was already in the federal capital as vice president when he was to take his oath of office, so he could not have made a great progress akin to Washington's 1789 journey. He would not have been celebrated similarly anyway. Still, he did his best to emulate the general, buying a $1,500 carriage. That was real money in 1797. With his new $25,000 presidential salary for the short trek from his boarding house to the Capitol. The powder in his scant hair was offset by his pearl suit, and he wore a sword at his hip. Liveried servants, whose fancy suits Adams had purchased, accompanied the president-elect. When Adams entered the chamber, Vice President Jefferson had already been seated, yet, perhaps for the only time, not the incoming president, but his predecessor was the star of the show. Adams' address took a markedly different tack from Washington's first inaugural. He began by recounting the genesis of the Revolution and the supposed sources of the Articles of Confederation, which he said had been known to be inadequate early in their life. He then gave a stock Federalist account of the symptoms of the Articles' failure and a happy summary of the creation of the United States Constitution. John Adams noted that he had been absent in England, as it happens, when the Constitution was written, and he falsely said that he had always praised it, in public as in private. Vice President Jefferson, listening to this address, might well have recalled that Adams' first evaluation of the Constitution to Jefferson had taken the form of a list of its positive and negative attributes. In response to what had come to be common Republican criticisms of him, Adams took pains repeatedly to say that he had never advocated life terms for any executive or legislative official. He then described in general terms his policy aims and asked that the all-powerful continue, quote, his blessing upon this nation. Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural will be notably different from his predecessors. He had several aims in mind. They shaped both his performance throughout the inauguration day and the content of his first inaugural address itself. In marked contrast to his predecessors, Jefferson walked from his boarding house on Capitol Hill to the Capitol. Though he was preceded by a contingent of local militiamen with swords drawn, a few D.C. marshals, and a couple of Adams' cabinet members, Jefferson's procession struck contemporaries as calculated not to display the, quote, pomp and pageantry of the Washington and Adams inaugurations. A description of the same scene early the previous October has it marked by hovels and all the materials for building, bricks, planks, stones, etc. The U.S. Capitol was then a large, square, ungraceful, white building. As only one wing of the Capitol, the Senate wing, had been completed, Jefferson would speak there. When he entered the room, the audience would have noticed that, though certainly able to afford impressive clothing, Jefferson showed up at the big event dressed notably downscale, with no ceremonial sword in sight. An eyewitness and Jefferson acquaintance, Mrs. Margaret B. Smith, described the event this way, quote, I have this morning witnessed one of the most interesting scenes a free people can ever witness. The changes of administration, which in every government and in every age have most generally been epics of confusion, villainy, and bloodshed, in this our happy country take place without any species of distraction or disorder. I cannot describe the agitation I felt while I looked around on the various multitude, and while I listened to an address containing principles the most correct, sentiments the most liberal, and wishes the most benevolent, conveyed in the most appropriate and eloquent language, and in a manner mild as it was firm. The Senate chamber was so crowded that I believe not another creature could enter. The speech was delivered in so low a tone that few heard it. You might note that Thomas Jefferson is only known to have given 2 public speeches in his life. His first inaugural address and his second inaugural address. The party change in control of the federal government, a novelty in world history, stood out. It occasioned no confusion, villainy, or bloodshed in this our happy country. Smith undoubtedly had not been alone in thinking that this was just the way things would work in America. Thank God. In this she erred. The election of 1800-1801 was a near-run thing. Though the Republican tandem of Jefferson and Aaron Burr outstripped its Federalist opponents, President John Adams' challengers tied each other in the Electoral College. Who would succeed Adams? No one knew. Nowadays, according to the terms of the 12th Amendment, members of the Electoral College cast one vote for president and another for vice president. The 12th Amendment, however, corrected a problem highlighted by the election of 1800. Under the Constitution, as it came out of the Philadelphia Convention and framed it, each elector cast 2 undifferentiated votes. The framers did not foresee the advent of political parties, and so they did not envision a scenario in which running mates each received votes from all of their party's electors, and thus had the same number of electoral votes. In 1796, when Jefferson won the vice presidency by coming in second to John Adams, he edged out his running mate, Burr. A few Virginian Republican electors' decision not to vote for Burr so that their man Jefferson would beat him accounted for the margin. Burr remembered his fellow Republicans' 1796 betrayal in 1800 and 1801. If some Republicans thought Burr ought to announce to the world that Jefferson should be the House of Representatives' choice, why should Burr have been among them? Through the entire 36-ballot contest, Burr issued no public statement. Rumors circulated concerning supposed negotiations for Federalist support of a Burr presidency, but from what we can tell, Burr rejected any consideration of turning coat. Meanwhile, former Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton encouraged Federalist representatives to opt for Jefferson. If there was a man in the world I ought to hate, Hamilton confided, it is Jefferson. With Burr, I have always been personally well. He said more, Jefferson or Burr? The former, without all doubt. The latter, in my judgment, has no principle, public or private, could be bound by no agreement, will listen to no monitor but his ambition, and for this purpose will use the worst part of the community as a ladder to climb to permanent power and an instrument to crush the better part. He is bankrupt beyond redemption except by the resources that grow out of war and disorder, or by a sale to a foreign power, or by great peculation. War with Great Britain would be the immediate instrument. He is sanguine enough to hope everything, daring enough to attempt everything, wicked enough to scruple nothing. From the elevation of such a man, heaven preserve the country. The Republicans did not have to be told that, however. They ought to be allowed the outcome they preferred after some kind of bargain was struck. So, Hamilton counseled, let our situation be improved to obtain from Jefferson assurances on certain points. The maintenance of the present system, especially on the cardinal articles of public credit, a navy, neutrality. When the House finally did elect Jefferson, the public did not know why. In later years, The Delaware congressman whose switch from Burr to abstention had proven decisive gave an account of the bargain he had struck, remarkably similar to Hamilton's suggestion. That congressman's version of history receives substantial report from the reality that President Jefferson ultimately provided all three items on Hamilton's wish list. Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address would signal whether party contestation would continue at its accustomed pitch. He said social life should return to normal, a state in which Jefferson's principles were recognized as Americans' principles. This tall, thin, unassuming man envisioned a different course for America's political elite and for Americans at large. Let us then, fellow citizens, he implored, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. This was not mere verbiage. Jefferson ached for close relationships with intellectual peers, with fellow citizens and foreign members of the Republic of Letters disposed to share such relationships with him. He continued, saying, "And let us reflect that having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little if we countenance the political intolerance as despotic, as wicked, and capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions." The extreme political acrimony of the 1790s had not arisen unprovoked, he insisted. It owed to divisions over the French Revolution. Republicans had been extremely hopeful that America's ally, Louis XVI, and his numerous soldiers who had fought in the American Revolution might succeed in reforming the land where a king could rightly say, "L'État, c'est moi." The state, it is I, into a constitutional monarchy. Jefferson, then the United States ambassador, had participated in the early French reform efforts, and his hopes had proven most enduring of all. Yet, in the end, Federalists saw their forecasts fulfilled as French republicanism degenerated into tyranny, then into an imperial government. As Jefferson put it, quote, "During the throes and convulsions of the ancient world, during the agonizing spasms of an infuriated man, seeking through blood and slaughter his long-lost liberty, it was not wonderful that the agitation of the billows should reach even this distant and peaceful shore, that this should be more felt and feared by some and less by others, and should divide opinions as to measures of safety." Then came the passage most noted at the time and most often remembered since. Yes, Americans had been divided in the 1790s, but, quote, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names, brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." Members of Jefferson's U.S. Capitol audience must have smiled, even gasped, at this. The Federalist Party, newly thrown into opposition, was gleeful. From such a man as they thought Jefferson to be, at least as they had said he was, they would never have heard such a thing. He was a gallows man, a Jacobin, a beast, whose election, according to Connecticut's leading churchmen, might mean the government would burn New Englanders' family Bibles and somehow make their, quote, "wives and daughters victims of legal prostitution," unquote. In France, les tricoteuses had stationed themselves on the Place de la Révolution day after day to watch as enemies of the revolution were beheaded with that grisly, efficient invention of Dr. Guillotine. Perhaps the same fate lay in store for Federalist leaders. But no. Quote, "If there be any among us," Jefferson intoned, "who would wish to dissolve this union," that is, who were not Federalist, "or to change its Republican form," i.e., who were not Republican, "let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. American Republicans were not French revolutionaries at last. Soon enough, run-of-the-mill Jeffersonians would lament their leader's refusal to purge all of their defeated enemies from office and appoint Republicans in their places. Jefferson struggled to ignore them. One ground of Federalist fear concerned the Adams administration's military buildup. Republicans had opposed it. Would they undo it? Perhaps they would. Jeffersonians denied that palaces, crowns, and warships were the measure of national greatness. Unlike some leading Federalists, they did not murmur among themselves that only kings, lords, and large armies could keep a country safe. Quote, "I know indeed that some honest men fear a Republican government cannot be strong," Jefferson held, "that this government is not strong enough. But would the honest patriot, in the full tide of successful experiment, abandon a government which has so far kept us free and firm on the theoretic and visionary fear that this government, the world's best hope, may by possibility want energy to preserve itself?" In other words, would a true American abandon republicanism out of fear that it might fail? I trust not. I believe this: the strongest government on earth. I believe it is the only one where every man, at the call of the law, would fly to the standard of the law and would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. There need not be a peacetime army. Americans would defend the country if need be. Given his wartime experience as governor of Virginia, Jefferson could not have been as certain of this as he tried to seem. A hiatus in the Napoleonic Wars, however, seemed an apt occasion to try. Jefferson next described the United States as he understood them. Americans ought to hold to their, quote, federal and republican principles, their attachment to union and representative government, their isolation from the old world, their, quote, chosen country with room enough for descendants to the thousandth and thousandth generation, their devotion to the principle that esteem followed achievement rather than inheritance, their, quote, benign religion, inculcating honesty, truth, temperance, gratitude, and love of man, acknowledging and adoring and overruling providence, unquote, concern for man's happiness. All of these signaled the likelihood of the American Republican experiment's success. Still, one thing more, he insisted, was needed for Americans to be a happy and a prosperous people: a wise and frugal government. It would protect men from each other, quote, leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and not take from the mouth of labor the bread it had earned, unquote. He summarized his little essay in political science by saying, this is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicities. In his penultimate paragraph, Jefferson summarized his personal political philosophy, which by this time was Republican's philosophy. He began by saying his fellow citizens had a right to understand his principles of government and thus of administration. The first of these was equal and exact justice to all men of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political. Careful observers of the political scene knew Jefferson as author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. That law had disentangled the Old Dominion's government from its former established church. It also banned government discrimination based on religion. These Jeffersonian policies rested on the assertion that, quote-unquote, Almighty God had made man free in this regard. Next, Jefferson laid down in immortal language his devotion to, quote, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. An attentive Federalist might have thought this a paean to Hamiltonian neutrality. It was more. Jefferson here undertook, and his successors would continue, an experiment in foreign relations based not on nations' military capacity, but on liberal economics. Trade would improve man's lot, and so nations should remain at peace. Trading partners would be friends. Unforeseen developments overseas in time scuttled this new departure, though not Americans' attraction to it. Jefferson next pledged his devotion to the support of the state governments in all their rights, as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns, and the surest bulwarks against anti-republican tendencies, and the preservation of the general government in its whole constitutional vigor, as the sheet anchor of our peace at home and safety abroad. For Jefferson, federalism was a two-sided coin. To abandon either principle would mean the failure of the American experiment. Scholars in our own day have been prone to wish away Jefferson's devotion to federalism, aka states' rights. A recent account of the first inaugural considers the principles Jefferson listed in this extended passage at length, omitting only one, his stated commitment to the state governments and all their rights. Leaving out one of these two twin principles, federalism, while remaining attentive to, quote, the general government in its whole constitutional vigor, has over time yielded a significantly distorted, far less Republican constitutional system, one utterly unlike what Jeffersonians hoped the United States would become. Jefferson's vow in this speech that both principles would be respected foretold much of American history over the next quarter century. Jefferson continued through a list of important American principles: free elections, majority rule, reliance on militia in peacetime, subordination of soldiers to civilian officials, quote, economy in the public expense, unquote, the honest payment of our debts, open rather than secretive government, quote, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of person under the protection of habeas corpus, and trials by juries impartially selected. These principles, he concluded, should be the creed of our political faith. He and his audience could not know it, but these would be the principles not only of Jefferson's administration, but of James Madison and James Monroe's administrations as well. While it is not apparent now, Jefferson honed that list of principles to cool the partisan flame of the 1790s, which still divided the country as he spoke. On one hand, the opposition Federalists could be expected to dislike his insistence that militia, rather than professional soldiers, could be counted on to defend the country most of the time. On the other hand, Federalists could be, in fact were, relieved by his vow to ensure that the United States government met its debt obligations. The New England religious establishment in particular could be counted on to dislike hearing that its bête noire, now in the chief executive office, intended to mete out justice to people of all religious persuasions. But Federalists generally should be pleased by Jefferson's statements about the rights of the minority, rights Republicans believed they had often been denied while Federalists held power. President Jefferson closed his address with an appeal for Americans' indulgence. Having held the highest subordinate offices, he said, he had been Vice President and Secretary of State, quote, I have learned to expect that it will rarely fall to the lot of imperfect man to retire from this station with the reputation and the favor which bring him into it, unquote. Jefferson had intended in a bipartisan gesture to compliment both of his predecessors. But John Adams slipped out of town rather than participate in the day's solemnities. So Jefferson revised his address to make reference only to George Washington. He thus said, quote, without pretensions to that high confidence which you